What's going on, everyone? Thanks again for coming back to the channel. We're going to do another tech talk today, and today's a topic, or about one of my favorite items, which is migration strategies into AVS. So we got a special co-host today, Will Mason. Will, you want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Yes, my name is Will Mason. I am a Azure and VMware specialist with Presidio. I focus primarily on Microsoft solutions and migrations into the Azure cloud. I've been with Presidio for about 13 years, starting off on VMware in the 3.5 age, and have just kind of followed. And as much as I differentiate, the product follows suit, and it's been a relationship the entire time since.
Yeah, and that's how we ran into each other. We obviously had mutual customers, and you maybe say a couple of things about Presidio and what Presidio does, because I'm sure people that view this video may not necessarily have heard of Presidio before.
So we are a $4.6 billion consulting firm that is around the world. We specialize in data center, networking, um, artificial intelligence, and a whole plethora of other technologies. We're also one of Cisco's top partners. We're also one of Dell's top partners. We're pretty much all around the world, and this is just one of the areas that we specialize in.
Very cool. Very cool. So to kind of kick off this conversation, I thought we'd first start with, there's a lot of people that are looking at moving into AVS. And I'd say the lion's share, now this is not every use case, and I'm sure you can attest to this, but at least the majority of these are some sort of evacuation use case. And that could be like an evacuation of just a cluster or a rack of systems. But oftentimes, what I run into, and maybe you could validate, they're evacuating entire data centers, or they're shutting it down the entire thing. Is that kind of what you run into?
The majority of times it's not just an evacuation of data centers plural. We even see it where we will be engaged with customers in Europe or throughout the United States are going, I've got 6 different contracts across 6 different geographic data centers, and each one of these is going to be up for either a renewal or closure over the next 24 months. So we end up working with a lot of our customers, not just on a straight tactical, let's move up to AVS into the cloud, but to more of a strategic, let's start a basis of a landing zone. Let's start our environment. We're gonna go one at a time and just start moving things up.
Yeah, and that's such a fantastic segue, because you're basically moving data center resources, right? And so AVS is easy. Easy is a relative term. Like, there is still an entire data center of things like logging, backup, alerting, tooling that have to go with it. That oftentimes people just focus on the AVS bit. But if you're doing, like you said, a co-location or another data center, another site, you have to think of all the services around that site. Sometimes people start small, but I know that's like what Presidio does when they work with customers, is like, okay, got the VMware bit. That's good. But what about all these other items? Like, I'm sure that's something that you engage with customers on all the time.
It does. Honestly, a lot of the solutioning around these topics a lot of our direction kind of is determined by where the enterprise is already going. So, for example, we'll take logging. Now, you do within the Azure portal have the ability to do a redirect of all the VMware syslogs, those that exist in etc config, to a log analytics repository. And some do that. One of the drawbacks is that you are kind of limited in that you're having to develop your own KQL, and your alerting and all of that kind of stays within the Azure layer. It For those that are moving, it can be sometimes jarring, but most definitely a little bit of a slope to gain the knowledge. Now, as time has gone by, a lot of the vendors like Splunk, Logarithm, some of those that are their whole job is to do ingestion of logs. They've already started to build their products around the Microsoft's pub sub model, which is the Event Hub. And so we show a lot of success in when the question comes up, what do we do about our logs? From our standpoint, it turns into a very easy conversation of we're just going to redirect all the logs from the AVS to a log, or excuse me, to an Event Hub workspace. And from there, it becomes more of working with the customer and working with their vendor on doing whatever integration they need to be able for their product to be able to subscribe to that Event Hub. And if you're looking for support, that's going to be one of the major phrases is, since this is a pub sub model, does my product have the ability to subscribe to an Event Hub workspace?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, this is really sort of oversimplifying it, but you're going to find that consistency in all of these is like there's going to be a Microsoft product for these type of solutions. And by and large, if you want to adopt more Microsoft products, you're welcome to do so. And they do make it easy to do so. But a lot of times when I'm engaging with customers and we start hitting any of like these 4 buckets, the first question out of my mouth is, how do you do it today? Like, what are you using? What's the tooling? Because 9 times out of 10, that tooling you're using, whether it's for logging, backup, or alerting, can be leveraged in Azure, right? Whether it's like you just mentioned Splunk or some other logging tool that hits right on the next topic, which is backup. Many of these backup vendors have a deployment model in Azure, whether it's fully kind of customer managed in Azure IaaS or something slightly different. There is if you're in, like, I'd say the top 7 of the backup companies, if you're using one of their software, it will likely work with AVS. That's typically what you run into, or what do you usually guide on a backup?
Absolutely. In fact, there is a Microsoft supported backup product, MABS, that has the ability to do some of that. But quite honestly, most of the enterprises that are using this product, and I can cite Veeam as the easiest example from my experience. They've already got an Azure and cloud presence, and quite honestly, it's a VMware cluster in an Azure data center. So even at its core, the relative mechanics of doing a backup don't really change. And in fact, a lot of companies use this as a great situation to start dovetailing into better backup management.
Yeah.
Whether it's throwing to a storage account or having leveraging some of the immutability and archive options within their backup vendor.
It's tough because like this is always an opportunity when you're starting fresh is not the right term, but you're migrating and you get to kind of build a new house to make changes on how you do things. But oftentimes you also have to remember you don't want to change too much, because that's the goal. Is like, the nice thing around AVS is it limits the amount of change, because the truth is every organization is different and their ability to take on that change will vary. So sometimes people do use it as an opportunity to maybe even look up at a new backup vendor. But if it adds too much complexity on top of it, I always lean into stick with what you have. And once you get there, you can start making changes too. But make sure that the level of change, because there will be some level of change. We're trying to keep everything as consistent as possible with a product like AVS. But that's the goal, is like try to maintain as much change or as little change as possible, so that way you ultimately have a successful migration. Because when you make massive changes, sometimes that's what causes the risk in any migration.
And I will say, like, within my company, we call these MOM projects, and MOM stands for migrate to the cloud. And as you're migrating, you're going to want to optimize those workloads. And whether that's an optimization from the logging, it's an optimization from backup, and some of the other topics we're going to discuss here, being that we are moving effectively VMware to VMware, it reduces a lot of the scope and complexity and, quite honestly, intimidation that you're going to find when you're trying to optimize these workloads. And once you've really gone through the migration and the optimization, is normally not a part of the first engagement that we do on projects, but it's usually a follow-on and a more longer term follow-on, which is the modernization aspect.
Right.
So that's kind of how we look at these from our standpoint.
And specifically in that order, right? The migrate,
Yes.
optimize, modernize versus, oftentimes when you're forking the cloud, it feels like you have to do it all at once, right?
Well,
If you cut it up, it makes it much more digestible.
like we moved a customer. They had a data center they needed to get out within about like 90 days.
Mm.
And there were some very mission critical workloads, websites that get in upwards of 300,000 hits per month. If something's wrong, they're going to find out about it, not from a phone call, but they're going to find out about it from Twitter. And from our standpoint, one of the big like things that made a lot of this easier is as we're migrating some of these workloads and getting them staged within the AVS, we're already putting them behind Azure Front Door or Azure App Gateway. And right now they're in steady state, but one of the follow-on initiatives that they're going to have is looking at converting some of these into some of the Azure native services, like Azure App Services. And once you've done the optimization, especially from a content delivery standpoint in the cloud already, it's just as easy as subbing in that Azure App Service as a member of the backend pool. So
Mm-hmm.
you're reducing your change window, you're reducing your impact, and at the same time, you're reducing the amount of organizational and technical debt that you've really got to get down to the bottom of. That is what you normally really have to work through when you're doing for example, on-prem to cloud native migration.
Yeah, it allows you to modernize more pragmatically is like,
Yes.
is the term I would use. And that's sort of the power of what AVS gives you is you forklift it up, you get it on the same platform you had before. Now I can pick and choose what I would modernize versus, like you said, if I do that from on-prem, inevitably going to run into an app dependency or a data gravity situation that makes this project bigger than I anticipated to be successful. I got to forklift this other stuff up, and it may have to go on a different platform, use different tooling and different backup processes. It's just all about, again, easy is a relative term, and I hate when I'm going through my slides talk about the easy buttons. It's all about the context of what makes it easier, and it is that amount of change is limiting that amount of change. I'll just say it. Migrations in general are hard. Like they're never like truly easy. They're easier with something like AVS, but what makes it the easiest is the planning aspect, and that's what I hope to get across in this tech talk is just thinking about all the things around the fringes when you're into that data center evacuation use case. So you hit on one of the perfect ones that customers ask all the time, and that's one of the things I love about having these conversations is we get to double click into the reality of situations is how long can it take to migrate to AVS? So if I were just to ask you that, you mentioned a customer had to get out in 90 days. How would you respond to that?
So there's two aspects to the argument. There's physics. What kind of speeds and feeds and what kind of operational movement can we have?
Yeah.
And then there's, we'll say, the non-physics, which are, how, what is going to be the workload dependency within the organization? Am I going to have multiple sysadmins, multiple network admins? How motivated can we be to get up there? Because sometimes, as much as the technical pieces can be there, you've also got to account for getting a lot of the human factor on board. Now, honestly, as that prior example, like we were doing it in 90 days because everybody was just kind of, not only was everybody in lockstep about what needed to be done, honestly, for a lot of organizations, this stuff is considered cutting edge. This is kind of the new frontier. So there is a lot of interest and a lot of excitement on being able to do something. And especially if you're the sysadmin that's always had to like go out to Terramark or go out to Peak 10 at 2 o'clock in the morning to rebounce an IIS server and
Yeah.
that nobody will replace because it's sitting on an ESX host that's very, very old and nobody can figure out how to replace. Dude, moving these things up into the cloud, especially into the AVS, just makes it's going to reduce the amount of workload.
Yeah.
Generally we can usually guarantee within about 90 days we can do in upwards of 200 to 300 VMs. we have gone as high. I mean, some of our projects will span as long as 18 months, moving thousands of virtual machines. It really comes down to locations and those pieces. But if it's an absolute, like, we need to go now, generally, as long as we have about 60 days headway, we can generally make it happen if it's within about 500 to 700 VMs.
Yeah, you hit like one of the biggest things is like, is the organization in lockstep? And nothing is more fun than an entire organization rallying behind a common goal. Like those are the most exciting because that's when, you know, the VMware teams lockstep on getting to AVS. The networking team knows that this landing zone has to be set up. The security team knows that it has to, you know, meet certain requirements, and everyone's marching towards the same goal. It's amazing how fast it can get done. Oftentimes when different parts are kind of like split across different projects and they're not aligned, that can definitely really delay things. Just, you know, those are all the things around the technology. And just like you said, I mean, there's the basic speeds and feeds, like 1500 VM workload movement is different than 200, right? So there's those things that are just physics and technology, but this solution in AVS is something that if you have a will, there is a way to do it in weeks. You could do it in weeks. You could do it in days if it's a small enough environment. So it's, you know, it's such a span of, you know, depending on the organization's goals and other items around the organization.
And I'll tell you, like, one of the things we're going to segue into is application mapping. And I will tell you one of the secrets, like, to a lot of this stuff is, you know, when the projects start off with, you're throwing out, you know, in some cases a 3 subscription or a multi-subscription enterprise landing zone. And for a lot of the customers, this is very new, very intimidating stuff. So when you get to this stage where AVS is up and HCX is up, there's still a lot that you can still find that customers have a lot of intimidation, a lot of fear, because sometimes you don't know if the boat will float until it's in the water.
Yeah.
Now, what I like to do, and my secret to some of this is when we do the HCX setup, we will do alpha, what I call alpha and beta migrations of just random test workloads. One to test the service mesh and to test the connections just in general, and then another to kind of test the pipe. And then when we start talking about application mapping, you're not going to go start with your mission critical applications. You're going to start with maybe your QA and dev. You're going to start with your stuff. Even once you've moved past that, you're going to move on to maybe, you know, maybe the pseudo secondary critical applications. Well, in addition to the fact that you just want to minimize the amount of impact to the organization if a problem happens, one of the really nice ways that you do this, and one of the really nice side effects is it helps build confidence with the platform, and it helps build everybody's faith with the platform, the constructs, and the overall plan on just how you're going to get to the cloud.
And it gives you learnings, right? Like every time you finish it, there's going to be something like, oh, we didn't plan for that, or we didn't expect that. And that allows us to pick up that momentum into the next wave.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And honestly, you know, the first couple of waves they can be some work. You're sometimes discovering network rules that nobody's ever run into before. You're sometimes discovering, I had one customer, we moved everything up. Some of their credit card transactions were broken because there was an undocumented route for a credit card processor at a specific IP address. And when we moved everything up, the IP address that was originating for all these workloads was different, and it wasn't whitelisted, and that was never documented. And we found it and we fixed it. But it's an example of some of the things that will make the first couple of waves a little bit educational. But honestly, by about wave 4, wave 5, and onward, everybody is happy, everybody is confident, and it just kind of flows.
Yeah. There is a crawl, walk, run mentality.
Absolutely.
To even migrations that really do add speed. You know, tools are something that are always fun to talk about. You know, what tools do you find work in Presidio? I mean, I'll mention the obvious ones, and these may be the same that you use. Is RV tools can be a great way not only to estimate infrastructure when you do a sizing exercise and understand how many nodes do I need to service a certain amount of workloads. I've had customers also use that as sort of like the migration sheet. Like they have, they do an export, they have all the names, and they may export it every couple, weeks or so, depending on what they're doing. And then they use those to, notify their application users, hey, these are the VMs moving, these may be associated to you. Another one I've seen used, not all the time, but it can be effective, is like it was previously called vRealize Network Insight, now ARIA for Networks. And my favorite story on that one, I had a customer that was moving an application with a health department. And they had sent him manually from the RV tools, like, here are the VMs we want to move, and these are the networks they're associated with. And the admin was thinking, well, this is on me if it doesn't go well. I better double check their work, and ran Vernie and found that they actually missed 3 networks and a couple of VMs that were associated with the test dev process. And we were like, I think you need this, right? And they said, oh my gosh, I'm so happy you found that. Otherwise, we would have had to roll back because it had some of these critical things that made the environment work. Any other tools you can think of off the top of your head that maybe you
So
leverage?
so we will take in RV tools. We
Mm-hmm.
will use RV tools. We have some internal stuff that can do some ballpark calculations, especially we're talking like node size. Honestly, one of the easiest and most readily available ones that I like is Azure Migrate. Like,
Mm-hmm.
honestly, take the appliance, throw it in there. It's got a piece that will specifically scope out planning and scope out information that will pertain to what kind of AVS size you should get.
Mm-hmm.
It does have some limited dependency mapping. And I say, it will tell you, for example, let's say you have a SQL server. It will tell you you have 200 devices trying to connect on 1433.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't do a lot of, it will tell you 200 devices, and it may even give you a list of those 200 devices. It's not going to tell you why. And that one thing, so I'll jump to that in 1 second. We've used, there's another product out there called Cloud Logic, and then there's Dr. Migrate. And those are two paid products and services. One thing I'm going to say is, like, you still need to expect to be able to do application follow-up. So when it comes up, like, this is no, if a SQL server comes up, and SQL server is just really easily, from my book, one of those, everybody forgets about it until it goes down.
Yeah.
And until they realize it's magically an enterprise SQL server. So you really need to, even once you've gotten your application mapping product and you've got a loose idea of what dependencies are, you really need to be able, you really need to plan on at least having 1 or 2 meetings with your application owners, because you want to be sure of what the impact is moving. One example is, we moved some software one time that, when we moved it from a network standpoint, it was fine. When we checked the application, when the customer did, the application was broken, because when we moved it, it was dependent on a MAC address that was tied to a specific NIC. And when we moved it, we didn't carry the MAC.
Mm.
And so finding out those little eccentricities of your app are going to be really important.
Yeah. And like you said, it's not always documented. So like, and
Absolutely.
it's an opportunity to document the undocumented, right? In this move.
Sometimes it feels like CSI, and everybody's just banging on the keys, and they're seeing all the little lines go. And honestly, sometimes it feels like a 1930s detective novel, trying to figure out what and where this application, and why is it even.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I mean, it's like, just as I hope, people are picking up, there's no silver bullet. There's paid for tools, there's free tools. Just use something at your disposal, right? Like, because it will get you closer to it. It will not automatically fix and tell you every application need you have for a migration wave, but it will get you closer to that goal. And so you should leverage them where you can.
And there's one more tip I do want to bring up, because this comes up a lot, is we will have customers come to us and say, like, I need to move The CIO comes to us and says, I need to move 4,000 virtual machines in 12 months, 24 months. They will give us an RV tools output. And one of the first things we do is we look and we see how many virtual machines are powered off.
Yeah.
When you hand us being your integrator or your support system, when you hand over that RV tools, you really want to make sure that if it's not important, and especially if it's powered off and it's not important, that it's not on that list, because that can be the difference between somebody telling you you need a 16 node AVS cluster versus you need more like a 5 or 6 node AVS cluster.
Yeah. And that can be extra true when it comes to storage,
Yeah.
because it won't drive up the CPU memory demand, but storage is persistent out of that. And so if the VM's off, it still has a storage capacity that you have to account for sure. Okay, so like for a lot of people that do watch this channel, a lot of people are deep in the weeds into AVS. I wanted to make sure to put some tips and tricks from your experience and my experience for HCX. So this is not HCX 101. We have plenty of content around HCX 101. This is kind of like, like more anecdotal. Keep these in mind when you use HCX. It'll help you understand what challenges you can run into in the vein of migrations. So what most people will know is an HCX, if you've worked with it, it deploys what's called a service mesh. And you can have multiple service meshes with HCX, even just to one AVS environment. And a service mesh will always have an IX appliance, just one IX appliance, and can have multiple network extension appliances. If I recall off the top of my head, specifically to AVS, I think you can go up to 10 network extension appliances, and that has to do with how they subdivide the /22 network that they associate with AVS. And so one thing that people can run into is bandwidth limitations. Not so much on the IX, that can happen, and I have had customers that have very high change rate VMs when they're doing a bulk migration instead of doing those Delta syncs. They'll take those really high change rate VMs and those beefy VMs, put them on its own service mesh. So the IX is kind of dedicated to the busy guys. And then you can set up a different migration wave with all the rest of the VMs that aren't as busy. Because you can get to points where there's so much high churn, the IX appliance has difficulty keeping up with those changes to do a switchover. So one thing to keep in mind, you may want to deploy multiple service meshes. The other one that you can run into, maybe I'll have Will, you talk to it more, the network extension appliances. I believe that their maximum throughput is 4 to 6 gigabits per second. But we can actually do a total of 8 VLAN extensions on one network extension appliance. So I don't know, any feedback there or anything you've experienced with a network extension?
So for a lot of our network extensions, we are recommending, because we have found issues of having like a huge amount of network extensions on one service mesh across an environment that has multiple clusters. So we will typically, for very large environments, we'll typically start off with a service mesh per cluster. And then from there, sometimes the way we tend to move things, we tend not to really hit that max layer 2 extension limit yet. Because what we try and do in a situation where you have to do a layer 2 extension, we're trying to do evacuation.
Yeah.
So honestly, a lot of it turns into, let's see if we can evacuate. Let's evacuate the entire VLAN. And as you go through, when you go through your HCX migration setup, you can actually tag it at the VLAN level versus individual VLANs, or excuse me, individual VMs to actually move it up there. The other part is MON. Like honestly, the number of times that we have been troubleshooting throughput and going, well, we have a 10 gig express route and we are flying, but it is taking 45 minutes to move a 90 gig virtual machine that has nothing in it.
Yeah.
And it is the web optimizer. It's good, especially when you have a very, very low bandwidth kind of situation, whether it's an IPsec tunnel going across your vWAN hub or an express route. But if you see that you're having issues with that kind of throughput, that's normally the first places that I look is WAN-op enabled. Um,
Yeah, I
it's
think our general recommendation, if you have an express route over 1 gig, we just turn it off.
turn it off.
Don't even have it. That's a great point. And like that, to your point, it's a WAN optimizer, really meaning like if you're under a gig, we can do some fancy things to get you the most out of that 1 gig connection. But beyond that, we can't do much with the WAN op. So just remove it.
And I did see this once in the field, and that is if you're running an IPsec tunnel inside an express route,
Mm.
there isn't much help from the WAN op, even if you are running that
Yeah.
low of a piece. So you want to be careful how much complexity you throw at your lines getting in, and how much you throw at the HCX config.
Yeah. To comment on your previous, like the best network extension or VLAN extension is a short VLAN extension.
Absolutely.
Extend it, migrate, swing it, and move on. Right? Like that is the best way. We oftentimes we're having conversations of, well, what's the maximum I can do? How many can I extend all of them at once? And usually it's reeling them back a bit of like, let's do a few at a time and get them all over and swing it, because that lowers the complexity of what's extended, what's not extended, and what is source destination, and how do I troubleshoot if I'm running into network issues. So it's a great point I hadn't thought of until you had mentioned it.
And we like this is a real world example for a California client that we moved some of their stuff on a layer 2 extension into the cloud, and it was effectively their web front end, and one actually we left their SQL on prem. It was still on a layer 2, and what we found was, because of the mechanics of that extension, it added approximately 18 milliseconds per instance that the front end had to go to the back end. So if it had to go for a query, send a query back, and then it would go work its way, then it would be 18 milliseconds coming down, 18 coming back. Okay, oh, I need to return some more information from another dependency query. So now it's 18 milliseconds going back down, and it just turned into this where something as simple as pulling up a website that has a simple address form,
Yeah.
it took approximately 3 minutes to do it.
Yeah.
Um, in that instance, we ended up basically establishing a second SQL server in Azure and adding it to the availability group. And we did some mechanical stuff. But long story short, you really don't want to treat an L2 extension as a long-term piece of your foundation.
Yeah, you can pull it off, and you can use Mon and things like Network HA and APR to optimize that, but you're still adding a layer to your infrastructure that you're going to have to manage, and there's still the speed of light, to your point.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And 18 milliseconds may not make a difference maybe for just like one front end web app or something else. But like when you talk about sometimes these application databases being on the same physical switch essentially and going back and forth, you've just made it 18 times worse potentially.
Yep.
Right? So it's a great point. One other thing that, and tips and tricks that sometimes people that only have used HCX before know these, so I really wanted to share it with customers, is the idea of how to kind of leverage the migration switchover window to your advantage. I know you've probably done this a lot. How do you leverage the switchover workflow?
So we, from our standpoint, after you've done your waves, and after you've really started the bulk migration process, from our standpoint, we want as much data going northward as possible. And whether that is for a migration that's going to be next week, or quite honestly, for a migration for a wave that might be 3, 4, 5, 6 weeks from now.
Mm-hmm.
So what we like to do is, for us, we will schedule, at least at the HCX level, we will tell the HCX, like, we want to schedule this for 3 months away. And as long as you have the enable seed box checked between now and, we'll say, that those 3 months, it's going to continuously do delta syncs of your workloads up into the AVS continuously. Then when it For us, when it's time to actually cut over, which is normally a couple weeks, even though we may have set that job to be a couple months out, we will come in, and for us it's an open bridge that we're working with our customers and we're communicating. We're going, okay, are we ready to cut over? Yes, we are ready to cut over. So we will go in and we can either at the entire bulk migration list manually tell it in this box that's showing up here, ignore the plan, and I want you to cut over as soon as possible.
Yeah, that little tick box you see in the center of the screen is sort of like, okay, now let's go ahead and start this migration.
Just
So
do
it
it
could,
now.
yeah, it could be set up here later for, you could say December, but when you tick this box and then you apply it, it's going to start moving those VMs over. It's
And
ready to go.
and the reason we do this, in addition to just having a little bit more control over when we actually migrate, because we tend to believe we want a human that's actually there at the time of failover or cutover, is sometimes things happen and you've got to change your wave, and you've got to change. Oh, we can't cut over this. We can't cut over this weekend for reasons, and it just makes it easier to where you don't have to change anything. Obviously, you don't want to keep pushing out your cutover window beyond what the schedule allows.
Yeah.
But we have found a lot of success in doing it this way. It's a minor thing, but it really does take a little bit more of the intimidation out of this process, because it does take specifically a human hand to check that box.
Yeah. Yeah, I remember the first time someone, this is like inside baseball type of stuff. If you haven't worked with the tool a whole lot, some people have figured this out as a great way to just manage it more effectively. Because, if you hit that and you cancel it, you got to restart that migration project and all that data has to go over again. So it's great to just get the data started, get it over there and just in a delta sync phase, versus you set it for a certain date and canceled it and have to restart those replication jobs all over again. So
you got to go through and you got to clean it up, and you basically have to get HCX back into a state where it feels ready to do the same thing over again. And let's be real, it's not a big deal when you're moving, let's say, 1 or 2 terabytes. I mean, the cool thing, one of the coolest things about this product is it's not doing everything sequential. So those 6 or so servers that are on this list, when we kick this off, it's going to, based off of the metrics and mechanics it sees of the speeds and feeds, it's going to start kicking off individual copies of each one of those. So in theory, I'm not necessarily moving one virtual machine at a time and then it goes off to the next one. I'm moving 6, 7, and 8. I could be moving 36, 40, 50 terabytes worth of data.
Yeah.
And when you start thinking about the time that it takes to move that amount of data, the last thing you want to do is have to start all over again.
Start all over. It's a good call out, because I have had some people set up a job for one VM and then try to think, oh, well, now I just times that by terabytes times the number of VMs. No, HCX is built for parallel migrations. Like single threads will only get you so far, but multiple VMs and multiple threads will really, start utilizing the bandwidth you have to the destination, start replicating pretty fast. And if you're worried about, the throughput, I don't know if you have done this before. I know you can cap the throughput with the WAN optimizer. So if the WAN optimizer is in your environment, you can say only chew up 500 megabits of my 1 gig pipe. So there's some tools you can leverage there to make sure that you're not overrunning other front end workloads.
We absolutely had to cap it, and I can call out this kind of story because it's probably one of the weirdest reasons that we had to do a cap. But we go and we kick off a migration of about, I think it was about 32 terabytes, and as soon as we kick it off, customers start seeing like alarms go everywhere, and virtual machines just aren't responding. Somebody tries to, they log into vCenter and they try and get on a virtual machine console, and it literally takes 10 minutes for them to log on there. Well, we start looking at stuff, and the speed is fine, and it's even, honestly, it's even on its own express route. What we found was they were running a hybrid array, and we put so many on there combined with a wide open no bandwidth limiter, because it was on an express route. Don't need it. It basically flooded the fast cache on that storage array, and effectively we turned that storage array into a 7,200 RPM SAN array from 2003.
Yeah, you took it back in time.
And so one of the ways that we started doing some of this is we just heavily capped it, because if HCX detects it's got some caps and it's limited, it's not just going to open everything up wide open immediately.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's a great point. It's just another example of bottlenecks can happen throughout the physical layer, the network, the WAN layer and the software layer. And you have to have that full approach just to make sure to be able to troubleshoot issues and get to a good spot. Well, this was really cool. Well, I appreciate you jumping on and sharing your experience. I hope other people found it helpful. I know I did. I think those stories from the trenches or stories around the campfire of those times can be super helpful for people that are just starting their journey. So I want to thank Will and everyone else that took time to watch today. I appreciate everyone. Have a good one.
Thank you, guys.